The bullet missed Reed Callahan's spine by less than 2 inches, which meant he was alive, which meant someone had failed, and in his world, failure wasn't something you apologized for, it was something you didn't survive long enough to repeat. His SUV went off the highway somewhere outside Whitehall, Montana at 2:47 inches the morning during the kind of storm that doesn't ask permission. It just erases the road and everything on it, and lets God sort out whoever's left by dawn. He didn't remember the impact. He remembered the sound of his father's voice, which was strange, because his father had been dead 4 years. And he remembered the taste of blood in his mouth. And he remembered thinking with the calm, detached clarity of a man who'd been calculating odds his entire life, that this was probably how it ended. Not in a war, not in a courtroom, but alone on a frozen highway, with a bullet wound in his side and a shattered windshield full of snow. He was 36 years old. He ran an empire that stretched from Seattle to the Canadian border, laundered money through 17 shell companies, employed 200 people who would kill for him, and a handful who apparently wanted to kill him instead. He wore 3-piece suits to funerals and business meetings with equal comfort. He'd read East of Eden 4 times, because his mother had written something inside the cover before she left, and he was still trying to understand what she meant. He hadn't spoken to another human being without calculating the cost of every word in over a decade. And now he was bleeding out in a ditch in the middle of nowhere, unconscious, with his hand still on the steering wheel and a book on the back seat and no one coming. No one except a 6-year-old girl named Bree Sullivan who was out looking for beetles under tree bark at first light, because that's what she did every morning regardless of whether there'd been a gunshot in the night, and who found him the way children find things, without fear, without hesitation, with the pure, practical directness of someone who hasn't yet learned that some things you find are better left alone. She ran back to the cabin. She told her mother, and her mother, May Sullivan, 27 years old, no husband, no family, no safety net. A woman who'd walked out of her 3rd foster home at 16 with $34 in her coat pocket, and had built everything she owned with her own 2 hands, and trusted absolutely no one, because every single time she had it cost her something she couldn't get back. May Sullivan looked at the man bleeding in the snow, with a gun on his passenger seat, and a deep cut along his jaw, and a suit that cost more than her truck, and she knew in her bones, that pulling him out of that car was the kind of decision that doesn't just change your morning, it changes your life, and not gently, not kindly, not in any way you'd choose. She pulled him out anyway. If this story satisfies that thing inside you that needs to know what happens next, leave a like so more people can find it. Share it with someone who deserves a good story tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because you won't want to miss what comes after. Now let's go back to that cabin in Montana, where May Sullivan is dragging a man she doesn't know across the snow, and her daughter is watching from the porch, and the storm isn't over yet. May Sullivan dragged a man who weighed at least 30 kilograms more than she did through snow nearly half a meter deep, with a plastic tarp she usually used to cover the stack of firewood behind the house. She didn't think about who he was. She didn't think about the gun on the passenger seat, or the blood-stained suit, or the white gold ring on his ring finger that she saw when she wrapped his arm into the tarp to keep him from sliding out. She thought about distance, 200 meters from the road to the cabin, and each meter was heavier than the one before, because the snow wouldn't stop falling, and the tarp kept catching on tree roots hidden under the ground. And this man, even unconscious, was still an adult human body made of bone and flesh, and gravity didn't care how tired she was. Bree ran ahead. The little girl didn't need to be told. 6 years old, and she already knew when her mother needed a door opened in advance, when her mother needed a path cleared, when to ask and when to act. She pushed the cabin door open, dragged the chair beside the fireplace out of the way, then stood waiting, both hands gripping the doorframe, her eyes on her mother pulling the tarp across the yard with the kind of silent concentration children only have when they understand that what is happening matters more than anything they could say. But May didn't bring him inside right away. She left the tarp on the porch, went back to the car lying tilted in the ditch, opened the passenger door, and took out the gun. She didn't know what kind it was. She didn't need to know. She only knew that it couldn't be left within reach of a man she knew nothing about, except that he had a gunshot wound in his side and wore a ring on his hand. She carried it back to the cabin first, wrapped in a kitchen towel, and shoved it under the refrigerator, where the floor sagged slightly and formed a gap large enough to hide something Bree would never think to look for. Then she went back to the porch and dragged him in. The fireplace was burning, Bree had added more wood while May was gone, and the warmth inside the cabin hit her face like a wall after the cold outside. She dragged him over beside the fireplace and had to shove the old rug aside. And when the rug slipped away, the cellar hatch beneath the kitchen floor was exposed. That wooden hatch with the rusted iron ring she had never opened since the day she moved in, because there had never been any reason to open it. She didn't think anything of it then. She only left the rug crooked and lowered him onto the wooden floor beside the heat. Bree had gone back to the car a second time without May noticing. When she turned around, the child was standing at the kitchen table, holding a paperback book with a bent spine, already open, setting it down on the table beside the water pitcher, as if it were the obvious thing that needed to be saved along with the man. East of Eden. May looked at the book for a second, and then turned back to what mattered more. She cut off his suit jacket and shirt with kitchen scissors, because there was no way to remove them without moving him too much. The gunshot wound was on his left side, a graze, not lodged inside, but it had left a tear as long as her finger, deep enough to show the fat beneath the skin, and blood was still seeping out slowly, that thickened blood of someone who had already lost a lot and whose body was trying to clot but couldn't keep up. His right jaw had a deep cut from shattered glass, shorter but spreading with bruising, and when she pressed lightly along the ribs on his left side, he groaned in his unconsciousness in the way people only groan when a bone has broken or cracked. May wasn't a nurse. She had never learned first aid anywhere, except in real life, but she had once stitched a gash on her own hand with a sewing needle and dental floss in the bathroom of a motel in Billings at 2 o'clock in the morning, because she didn't have insurance, and the emergency room would ask questions she didn't want to answer. She knew how to stop bleeding. She knew when a wound needed more than what she had. This wound needed more. She pressed gauze against his side, wrapped it tight with a clean towel, and when she washed the blood from his hand to see whether there were any other injuries, she saw the ring more clearly. White gold, plain, no decoration on the outside, but on the inside, along the edge that she only saw when she turned it to wipe the blood beneath it, there was an engraving. She didn't read it. She didn't need to read it. She only registered that it was there, the same way she registered the gun, the same way she registered the book, the same way she registered everything about this man without letting any detail become a reason to care more than necessary. He was a problem that needed solving, not a question that needed answering. She stood up, washed her hands in the sink, the water cold because she hadn't had time to heat any, and looked out the kitchen window. The snow was still falling so heavily that she couldn't see the tree line 30 meters from the cabin. Bree sat at the kitchen table, her legs swinging without touching the floor, opened her notebook of bug drawings, and began sketching something with a worn-down pencil, perfectly calm, as if every morning there were a blood-soaked man lying on their floor. May looked at her daughter, looked at the unconscious man beside the fireplace, looked at her own hands with blood still caught beneath the nails, and thought that she needed to call someone, but the phone had no signal. The road couldn't be traveled, and the only person she knew who could stitch a wound without asking unnecessary questions lived 8 miles away and could only be reached through the old frequency radio hanging on the kitchen wall, the one May had bought at a second-hand market 2 years earlier for $12, the most useful purchase she had ever made in her life, even though when she bought it, she hadn't known that at all. May lifted the radio off the hook on the kitchen wall, turned it to frequency 7, and pressed the call button. Static crackled through the small speaker for a few seconds before she spoke, brief, without greeting, without a long explanation, only saying that she needed Bonnie to come right away and bring the fullest medical kit she had. The line stayed silent long enough for May to think the signal had been lost. Then Bonnie Pruitt's voice came through, rough and low, the voice of a 45-year-old woman who had gotten up before dawn every day for 20 years as a nurse and was retired now, but still kept the habit because her body wouldn't let her sleep any longer. Bonnie didn't ask what had happened. Bonnie asked one thing only: is he still breathing? And when May said yes, Bonnie said 40 minutes and clicked off. May set the radio down and turned back to the man on the floor. He was still unconscious, his breathing shallow and quick, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead even though the air in the cabin wasn't nearly hot enough for that. Fever, maybe. Or shock. Or both. May replaced the towel that had soaked through with blood with another one, pressed harder, and sat down on the floor beside him with her back against the wall, not because she wanted to be close, but because she needed to keep pressure on the wound, and her hands were beginning to ache. Bree was still sitting at the kitchen table, drawing bugs, every so often lifting her head to look at the man on the floor, then at her mother, then back at the notebook, the cycle repeating itself steadily, as if the child were calming herself with rhythm. 40 minutes later, exactly as promised, the sound of a pickup engine carried through the snowstorm, then the slam of a car door, then the sound of heavy boots on the wooden steps, and Bonnie Pruitt walked in without knocking, carrying a white plastic case that May had seen twice before, once when Bree had burned with a high fever at 3 years old, and once when May had cut her hand splitting firewood last winter. Bonnie didn't look at May first. Bonnie looked at the man on the floor, looked at the blood-stained towel, looked at the pile of cut-off clothes on the floor, the suit, the shirt, good fabric, the kind of fabric neither woman in this room had ever worn. Then Bonnie knelt down and began to work. She worked the way only people who have done something thousands of times can work. Not rushed, not slow, only precise. She cut away the temporary dressing May had made, cleaned the wound at his side with antiseptic, checked the depth with gloved fingertips, confirmed that the bullet had only grazed him, and that there were no metal fragments inside, then began stitching with a surgical needle and thread kit that a retired nurse living in the middle of Montana had no proper reason to own, but Bonnie kept anyway, because Bonnie was the kind of person who always prepared for the things other people hoped would never happen. 12 stitches for the wound at his side, 7 for his jaw. Bonnie wrapped bandages around his rib cage, tight, even, confirmed that at least 2 ribs on the left side were cracked, and said there was nothing to do except bind it and let time handle the rest. She set 3 blister packs of pills on the kitchen table, antibiotics she had taken from her personal supply, the kind she kept in the house because she lived 45 miles from the nearest hospital and winter in Montana doesn't wait for you to drive to a clinic. Then she wrote the dosage on the back of a sheet of paper with a ballpoint pen in the small, neat, clear handwriting of someone used to writing prescriptions, and told May to give them every 8 hours, with food if possible, enough for 7 days. If the wound gets infected before then, call me. Then Bonnie stood up, washed her hands in the sink, dried them with a kitchen towel, and for the first time looked directly at May. Not a passing glance. A straight look, the kind of look 2 women living out in the wild give each other when they know something is not being said. This wasn't an ordinary car accident, Bonnie said. Not a question. Her voice was flat, not accusing, not overly worried, only a fact placed on the table between them like a knife that neither one needed to pick up. May didn't answer. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head, didn't explain. She only looked back at Bonnie with the face she had learned to keep since she was very young, the face that gave away nothing the other person had not already found for themselves. Bonnie understood. Bonnie always understood. That was why May had called Bonnie, and no one else. Because Bonnie Pruitt was the kind of person who asked exactly one question, did exactly what needed to be done, then went home without carrying away someone else's story. Bonnie put her coat back on, fastened the buttons, picked up the medical case, and said she would come back tomorrow to check the stitches and change the bandages. She walked toward the door, heavy boots on the wooden floor, and just before stepping out, she stopped. She didn't turn all the way around, only tilted her head, her eyes dropping to the kitchen floor, toward the refrigerator, where the kitchen towel wrapped around something heavy, stuck out just enough for someone who knew how to look to recognize the shape. Bonnie didn't say what it was. Bonnie didn't ask why. Bonnie only said, her voice lighter than before, but each word clear, "If you need me, I'm on frequency 7. Then she stepped out into the snow and closed the door behind her, and May stood alone in the cabin, with her daughter drawing bugs at the kitchen table, and a strange man breathing by the fireplace, and a gun beneath the refrigerator, and 3 blister packs of antibiotics on the table, and the feeling that she had stepped through a door she couldn't step back through, even though she still didn't know where that door led. He came to around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the first thing he did wasn't groan, wasn't call out, wasn't ask where he was. The first thing Reed Callahan did when he opened his eyes was scan. His eyes moved before his body could, from left to right, slow, methodical, in the way ordinary people never look at a room. Exit. 1. Front door. Wood. Simple latch. No deadbolt. Windows. 2. 1 to the left. 1 by the kitchen. Small. Shut tight. Snow clinging to the glass outside. People in the room. 2. 1 woman standing by the sink with her back turned. 1 child sitting at the kitchen table staring straight at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Weapons. None visible. But he knew there was one, because he remembered having one on the passenger seat, and it wasn't there anymore. Which meant someone had taken it, which meant someone in this room knew it existed and had made a decision about it. The entire scan took less than 3 seconds. It wasn't a habit. It was instinct. The kind of instinct sharpened by 20 years of living in a world where you either see danger before it reaches you, or you don't live long enough to see it a second time. Then he tried to sit up, and the pain in his left side drove him flat again like a punch from inside his ribcage. Fast, merciless, leaving no room for negotiation. He drew in a breath through his teeth, short, controlled, silent, and lay back on the wooden floor with his left hand pressed against the bandaged ribs he couldn't remember anyone wrapping. May turned around. She had heard him move from the moment he first opened his eyes. Not because she had been listening for him, but because in 4 years of living alone with Bree in this cabin, she had learned to hear everything: the creak of the floor, the shift in the wind, the change in breathing, and the sound of an unconscious body suddenly becoming an awake one. She stood by the sink, a kitchen towel over her shoulder, her hands dry, her face showing nothing except the cold attention she gave to anything she hadn't yet decided was a threat. He looked at her. She looked back. Silence stretched between them for a few seconds, the kind of silence heavier than any question, because both of them were reading the other, and both of them knew the other was doing the same. Reed Callahan had spent his whole life reading people. That was how he survived, how he rose, how he knew who would betray him before they knew it themselves. He read a lot on this woman's face in those few seconds. He read that she wasn't rich, not because of the small cabin or the worn clothes, but because of her hands. Rough, cracked across the knuckles, the kind of hands of someone who worked with them every day and had no hand cream in the bathroom. He read that she wasn't afraid. Not courage, not bravado, but the complete absence of fear in her eyes as she looked at him. And that was stranger than anything else he had seen all day, because Reed Callahan was used to people being afraid of him. Used to seeing that slight flicker in the eyes, that unconscious tightening of the shoulders, that shift in the air when he walked into a room, and this woman had none of it. She looked at him the way someone looks at a problem that needs handling. No more, no less. And he didn't know what to do with that. Bree broke the silence because Bree was 6, and 6-year-olds don't understand that some silences exist because neither side is ready to speak. "My mom pulled you out of the car," Bree said, her voice ordinary, not boastful, not seeking credit, just a fact delivered with the absolute directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to wrap words in secondary meanings. "You were really heavy." Reed looked at the little girl. Bree sat at the kitchen table, her bug notebook open in front of her, a worn-down pencil in her hand, her feet swinging without touching the floor, looking at him with the kind of calm curiosity only children and very dangerous people have, curiosity without judgment. "Thank you," Reed said, 2 words. His voice was rough, low, dry from dehydration and blood loss, but clear. He said it to Bree, not to May. Not because he wasn't grateful to the woman who had dragged him through the snow and hidden his gun and called someone to stitch up his side, but because Reed Callahan didn't know how to say thank you to an adult without turning it into a transaction, a debt, a string tied between them, and he wasn't ready to owe this woman anything. But to a 6-year-old child, thank you was just thank you, and that was why he said it to Bree. May saw that. She said nothing about it. She walked over to where he lay, stood looking down at him, and said, not loudly, not softly, her voice as flat as the surface of the wooden table, "Rules. You stay down. No getting up. No walking around. No touching anything in this house. When you're well enough to walk yourself out that door, you leave. I don't ask who you are. You don't tell me. We don't know each other, and when you leave here, we'll never see each other again. That's the deal. Do you have a problem with that deal?" It wasn't a question. Her voice left room for only one answer. Reed looked at her. He was used to negotiating, used to finding openings, used to reading what wasn't said more closely than what was. But there were no openings in this woman's face. There was nothing to negotiate, nothing to leverage, nothing to buy. She didn't want his money, didn't want to know who he was, wanted nothing except for him to stay still on her floor and disappear when he could. He nodded. One nod only, slow. Not because he agreed, but because for the first time in his life, he was somewhere his agreement wasn't a prerequisite. It was the only option. May turned and went back toward the kitchen, her back straight, her steps even, not looking back. Bree looked after her mother, then looked at Reed, then back at her mother again, the back-and-forth look of a child trying to understand something between 2 adults she didn't yet have words for. Reed lay back on the floor, his eyes on the ceiling, listening to May washing dishes in the kitchen, the running water, the sound of a plate being set down. Sounds so ordinary, they felt almost unreal to a man who had just been marked for death by order of his own cousin. He thought about that woman, not because she was beautiful or not beautiful, he hadn't had time to notice, but because she wasn't afraid of him. For 20 years, he had entered every room with the knowledge that his presence changed the air, that people adjusted, became more careful, quieter, more watchful. This woman adjusted nothing. She spoke to him the way someone speaks to a broken chair left in front of her house, something that needed to be moved when the weather allowed, nothing more. And Reed Callahan, the man who made hired killers think twice before sitting across from him, lay on the floor of a cabin in the middle of Montana and realized that what unsettled him most wasn't the gunshot wound in his side, wasn't Paxton, wasn't the loss of control, but the simple fact that a 27-year-old woman with cracked hands and a 6-year-old daughter looked straight into his eyes and saw nothing worth fearing. He didn't know whether that meant she was brave or that he mattered less than he had imagined. Both possibilities kept him awake. May woke at 4:15 in the morning, because she always woke at 4:15 in the morning. Her body didn't need an alarm clock. It had been programmed by 4 years of working the night shift at the gas station, and before that 23 years of waking in houses that weren't hers to make sure she knew everything before everything knew her. She lay in bed listening for a few seconds, the wind outside still driving snow against the window glass, the low crackle of the fireplace, Bree's steady breathing in the bed beside hers, and another breath, the man's breath out in the front room, shallower than normal because cracked ribs didn't let him draw a deep one. She went out, and he was already awake. Not newly awake, but awake for a long time. Maybe all night. His back against the wall beside the fireplace, both legs stretched out on the floor, eyes open, aimed at the front door. He wasn't looking at the door the way ordinary people look. He was watching the door. His whole body was still but not relaxed. The kind of stillness that belongs to someone in a state of readiness, even when his body wasn't capable of being ready for anything except lying still and enduring pain. He heard May step out and his eyes shifted from the door to her, quick, assessing, then went back to the door, as if she wasn't the priority threat, and he had already filed her into some category in his head the night before. May didn't say anything. She went into the kitchen, set the kettle on the gas stove, took out the coffee filter, poured in the grounds, the cheapest coffee Gus's store sold, the kind that people who know coffee would wrinkle their noses at. But May had never drunk anything else, so she didn't know there was anything to wrinkle at. She made 2 cups, black, no sugar, no milk. Not because she knew how he took it, but because that was the only way she made it. Sugar was a luxury she bought for Bree, and not for herself, and milk meant going to Gus's store, and the road was buried under 1/2 meter of snow. She set 1 cup on the floor beside him, not placing it directly in his hand, not saying anything, only setting it down and turning back to the kitchen. Reed looked at the cup of coffee, then at May's back turned toward him, then back at the coffee. He picked it up, took a drink, and said nothing. No thank you this time, because between adults, in the language both of them spoke, the language of people who never said more than necessary, a cup of coffee set on the floor didn't need to be answered with words. It was answered by drinking it. Bree woke at 6, and unlike her mother, she had no silent ritual. She came out of the bedroom into the front room with her bug notebook tucked under her arm, her eyes still a little swollen with sleep, her hair tangled, and walked straight to where Reed sat against the wall without stopping at the kitchen, without looking at her mother, without asking permission, then sat down on the floor beside him close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his elbow. May saw it, and everything inside her tightened. No one got to sit that close to her daughter. No one. Not because May was overly controlling, but because May had lived enough to know that the world wasn't kind to small children who had no one protecting them, and she was the only wall between Bree and everything outside, and that wall had no door. But she didn't call Bree back. She didn't know why. Maybe because of the way he didn't move when Bree sat down, didn't turn toward her, didn't say anything, didn't greet her, didn't smile, only let the child be there as if the presence of a 6-year-old girl beside him was something he accepted without needing a response. Maybe because something on his face changed, very slightly, not softened. Reed Callahan didn't look like a man who knew how to soften, but something shifted under the surface, a quiet attention that May only noticed because she was looking for a reason to pull Bree away and couldn't find one. Bree opened the notebook, turned to a page with a drawing of a large beetle with 2 horns on its head. the pencil lines messy but surprisingly accurate in proportion, and began to talk. "This is a stag beetle," she said, her voice so serious it was almost formal. "Its scientific name is Lucanus cervus, but I don't know how to spell cervus. Its jaws are really big, but it actually doesn't bite very hard because those jaws are for fighting other males, not for eating. It eats tree sap. The females don't have horns and they're smaller, but they bite harder than the males. My mom says so. Women are always more dangerous when nobody's looking." Reed listened. He listened for real, not the way adults listen to children talk, nodding, making little sounds, eyes somewhere else, waiting for them to finish so they can go back to what they were doing. He looked at the notebook, looked at the drawing, looked at Bree, and listened with the kind of focus May recognized because she had seen it when he scanned the room after waking. A total concentration, undivided, pouring itself entirely into one thing. Only this time, it was pouring itself into a child talking about stag beetles, instead of into identifying escape routes. May didn't know whether he listened out of politeness or because he was genuinely interested. But she knew the difference between someone pretending to pay attention and someone truly being present. And this man was present, completely, without pretending. In a conversation about stag beetles with a 6-year-old child at 6 in the morning in a cabin in the middle of a snowstorm. And she didn't know what to do with that information. May stood in the kitchen, her left hand holding her coffee cup, her right hand gripping the kitchen knife she hadn't even realized she had picked up, holding it tighter than necessary to peel anything, and she watched her daughter sitting beside a strange man with a gunshot wound in his side and a scar along his jaw talking about beetles as if this were the most ordinary morning of her life. And she thought that this wasn't an ordinary morning. This was the morning when something in this cabin was beginning to change. And she hadn't found a name for it yet, but she could feel it. The way you feel the air pressure change before a storm arrives. Not seen but known. And the knife in her hand was the only way she knew to tell herself that she was still alert, that she was still protecting, that she hadn't let go. It happened sometime around mid-morning, after Bree had said everything she knew about stag beetles, and moved on to drawing a new bug, whose name she didn't know yet, but had found under the maple tree behind the cabin last week. She set down her pencil, looked around the room for something else to do, and her eyes stopped on the book on the kitchen table, the book she had picked up from the back seat of the black car yesterday, and carried inside along with the man, as if the two belonged together. Bree took the book, carried it over to Reed, sat down beside him in the place she seemed to have already decided was hers since that morning, and opened to the first page. Then, she began to read out loud, not smoothly. Bree was 6 years old, and had only been learning to read for a little over a year, so she read slowly, stumbled over long words, mispronounced at least a third of them, and understood absolutely none of what she was reading because East of Eden wasn't a book for a 6-year-old child. It was Steinbeck, heavy and thick and full of sentences that made grown people stop and think. But Bree wasn't reading because she understood. Bree was reading for rhythm. She liked the way the words hooked into each other, liked the way some sentences stretched long and then snapped short, liked the sound a mouth made when it shaped words she didn't yet know the meaning of, and she read with the calm confidence of a child who didn't know what she was doing wrong and therefore had nothing to be embarrassed about. Reed listened. He didn't correct her pronunciation. He didn't explain the hard words. He lay against the wall with his eyes on the book in Bree's hands and listened, and there was something on his face May couldn't read. Not a smile, not sadness, something closer to recognition, as if he were hearing something familiar from a long time ago, and it had returned, not exactly the same, but close enough for him to know it. May was washing dishes when she saw the handwriting. Bree turned to the inside cover and tilted the book toward Reed to point out a word she couldn't read, and the angle of the book turned toward the kitchen, and May saw the line written on the blank page. Handwriting, blue ink, slanted letters. A woman's hand, soft but decisive. For Reed, so you remember there are things worth building, not just breaking. Signed, M. May looked at the sentence long enough to read every word, then she turned back to the sink. She didn't ask who M was. She didn't ask why a man with a bullet wound in his side and a gun in his car was carrying a novel with a note from someone telling him to remember there were things worth building, not just breaking. She didn't ask because the rule she had set last night was clear. No questions, no stories. And May Sullivan kept her word. Always. It was one of the very few things she believed about herself without hesitation. But she remembered. She put that sentence into the same drawer in her mind as the ring with the engraving. the gun under the refrigerator, the way he had scanned the room when he woke up, the way he had thanked Bree without thanking her, all the pieces she collected not out of curiosity but out of instinct, the same kind of instinct that always told her where the nearest exit was in every room she entered. Bree read 2 more pages and then stopped, not because she was bored, but because she remembered something more important than the book. "Do you know Colonel?" Bree said. And she said the name with the solemn weight children give to creatures they consider their closest friends. "Colonel is Mr. Gus's dog. Mr. Gus lives at the store 2 miles from here. Colonel only has 3 legs because his front right leg is gone. And Mom says that happened before we met Colonel, so I don't know what happened. And one of his eyes is cloudy, the left one, so Colonel can only see out of the right one, and Colonel is afraid of cats." May listened to her daughter tell a story she had heard at least 20 times. To Bonnie, to Gus, to Bree's kindergarten teacher, to just about anyone Bree had been around long enough to start talking to, and she thought this was the part where the man would nod politely and change the subject, or close his eyes and pretend he was tired. But Reed looked at Bree and said, his voice still rough, still low, but with something at the end of the sentence that May hadn't expected, a small fold in the tone that took her a second to recognize as humor. "Sounds qualified." 2 words, dry as dust. No smile, no wink. His face barely changed at all. But Bree understood. Bree laughed, sudden and loud, the kind of laugh a child gives when she really finds something funny and isn't laughing because an adult wants her to. And she said, "Colonel isn't qualified at all. Colonel doesn't even know how to sit when you tell him to sit." And that seemed to make Reed Callahan almost, only almost, let the corner of his mouth lift. May stood in the kitchen and realized she had set the knife down. Not on purpose. Her hand had let go of it without her noticing, and it was lying on the kitchen counter beside the wooden cutting board, and she didn't pick it up again. She didn't know what that meant. She only knew the knife was no longer in her hand, and she didn't feel the need for it to be there anymore. At least not now. At least not while Bree was laughing and the man was making a dry joke about a 3-legged dog afraid of cats. The morning went on slowly. Reed said a few more things. Not many. Each one short, exact, as if every word had been weighed before it left his mouth. He said the storm looked like it would last at least another day based on the direction of the wind, and he was right. May looked out the window and knew he was right because she knew how to read a storm too after 4 winters in Montana. He said the wound in his side felt clean, which meant the antibiotics were working, and the way he said it told May he had been injured before, and knew the difference between a wound that was healing and one that was turning bad. He asked Bree what the name of the bug she was drawing was, and that was the only question he asked all morning. Every sentence was neat. Every sentence was correct. Every sentence had not one extra word, and because of that, May knew. She knew he was lying. Not lying in the sense of saying something false. Lying in the sense that every sentence was too perfect, too fitted, too precise in exactly the measure he wanted to show, and not 1 millimeter more. Nobody talks that way unless every sentence has already been edited in the mind before being spoken. And nobody edits every sentence unless there is something behind it they are keeping back. May knew because May lied that way too. She had lied to 4 foster families, lied to social workers, lied to landlords, lied to emergency room doctors, lied to nearly everyone she had ever met using exactly the same method. Say little, say what is correct, say nothing unnecessary, and let the spaces between sentences fill themselves with whatever the listener wanted to believe. She recognized that method on his mouth because it was her own method, and there was nothing more unsettling than seeing yourself in a mirror when the mirror was a strange man lying on your floor. She didn't say anything. She picked the knife up again. Slowly, naturally, as if she were only getting ready to cut something for lunch. And maybe she was getting ready to cut something for lunch. Or maybe the knife returned to her hand because she had just realized this man was dangerous, not because he had a gun or money or enemies, but because he was like her. And May Sullivan had lived long enough to know there was nothing more dangerous than someone who understood exactly how you operated. It happened in the early afternoon, when the light beyond the windows had shifted from gray to a darker gray, and the snow had slowed enough for the tree line at the edge of the yard to become visible for the first time since the storm began. Bree was asleep in the bedroom, her bug notebook open on the pillow, her pencil rolled onto the floor, and the cabin was quiet in the way it was only quiet when she slept, because Bree was the only person in this house who made sound by choice. May was folding laundry at the kitchen table when she heard the scrape of fabric against wood, and when she turned, she saw Reed Callahan standing. Not fully standing, leaning against the wall with almost all his weight braced on his right shoulder, because the left side couldn't take the pressure, his face whiter than the tablecloth May had been folding, sweat stippling his forehead, and his eyes fixed on the phone in his hand. The phone May had seen in his pocket when she cut off his suit jacket yesterday, but hadn't taken out because it wasn't a gun, and she only cared about the things that could kill her daughter. The phone was dead, the screen black. He looked at it the way a man looks at a rope that has just snapped over a cliff, with the kind of controlled desperation only people used to controlling desperation know how to wear. May said, "I told you not to get up," her voice flat, not angry, only repeating a fact. Reed didn't look up. He said, and every word was clearly chosen with care before he let it out, "There's something in the car I need to get." May didn't answer right away. She looked at him, looked at the way he clung to the wall, as if the wall were the only thing keeping him from collapsing, and she knew he couldn't make it to the car, not because of the snow or the wind, but because 10 more steps, and he would fall, and she would have to drag him up a second time, and she didn't want to drag him up a second time. He knew she knew. So he kept going, still not looking at her, his eyes still on the dead phone. "There's something in the car that if someone else finds first, you'll want it gone." That sentence changed everything, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't say, because of the space between the words, because of the word if, and the word someone else, and the words you'll want. He didn't say I need it. He said you'll want it. And that meant whatever was in that car wasn't only his problem anymore. It was her problem, and Bree's problem, and this cabin's problem. And he was telling her that without saying it plainly because Reed Callahan never said anything plainly that could be said sideways. May set the shirt she had been folding down on the table, took her coat from the hook beside the door, put on her boots, and stepped outside without another word. The cold wind hit her face, but weaker than yesterday. The storm was slowing, though it still hadn't passed, and she followed the path she herself had made the morning before when she dragged him through the snow, a path now half covered but still lower than the snow around it, enough to let her walk faster than the first time. The SUV was still tipped in the ditch, more thickly buried now, the broken glass gone white, looking like a dead animal being slowly covered over. May opened the back door, having to use force because the hinge had bent in the crash, and searched. It didn't take long. Under the back seat, behind a leather floor mat, there was a bag, brown leather, medium-sized, heavier than it looked. May pulled it out, set it on the snow, and unzipped it. Cash. She saw the cash first because it was on top, stacked in neat bundles, the kind of large bills she had only seen in movies because nobody in Whitehall, Montana used that kind of money, and there was a lot of it. More than May Sullivan had ever seen gathered in one place in all 27 years of her life. More than the total amount she had earned in 4 years of working the night shift at the gas station. And she looked at it for 3 seconds, before looking at the next thing, because May wasn't the kind of person money could freeze. Under the cash was a phone. Small, cheap, the kind of throwaway phone people bought at convenience stores with cash. No contract, no name, no trail. Under the phone was a large envelope, sealed, thick paper, heavy, something inside it more than a single sheet. And at the bottom, lying face down, was a photograph. May turned it over, 2 men shaking hands. One of them wore a white shirt, younger, around 35, a face that looked a little like Reed's but softer, slicker, a smile too wide for eyes that weren't smiling. The other man was older, heavier, with a face May didn't recognize and had no reason to recognize. She looked at the photograph for 5 seconds. She didn't know who either of these men was. She didn't need to know. She only knew that a photograph hidden under a back seat with a pile of cash and a throwaway phone wasn't a family picture. She closed the bag, carried it back to the cabin, set it on the kitchen table in the middle of the half-folded laundry, and looked at Reed Callahan, who had slid back down to the floor, his back against the wall again, his face still white, the sweat still standing on his skin, his eyes on the bag on the table and then on her. "Who are you?" May said it without lifting her voice at the end. It wasn't a question. It was a door she opened even though the rule she had set the night before said that door had to stay shut. And she opened it because the leather bag on her kitchen table had changed the equation, because whatever had put a man with a gunshot wound and a bag of cash into a ditch during a snowstorm was now sitting on the table where her daughter ate breakfast every morning, and May needed to know what it was, not out of curiosity but out of survival. Reed looked at her, and for the first time since waking up, he seemed to be weighing whether or not to tell the truth, not because he was afraid, but because he was calculating what the truth would cost. For him, for her, for the child sleeping in the next room. Then he spoke, slow, spare, each sentence like a line item in a statement. He was letting her read only in the parts he chose. I have enemies. Not outside, inside. My cousin, Paxton Shaw. He looked at the photograph on the table that May had left face up. The man on the left, he said. That's Paxton. Then he stopped. May waited. She didn't push, didn't ask more, only stood at the kitchen table with both arms hanging at her sides and waited, because she knew that people who speak little don't speak faster when they're hurried. They speak less. Reed went on. If they find the car, they'll find the cabin. If they find the cabin, you don't want me here. That sentence hung in the cabin air between the smell of burning wood and cold coffee, and the trace of antiseptic still lingering from when Bonnie stitched his wounds. And May felt the cabin shrink, smaller, the walls closer, the ceiling lower, as if everything she had built over the past 4 years, the one small, safe hiding place she and Bree had just been turned by one sentence from a stranger into something else entirely. Not a refuge anymore, a target. Bree woke at exactly that moment, came out of the bedroom, her hair tangled, her eyes narrowed against the light, and stopped in the doorway to the front room when she saw the open bag on the table. She looked at the money. She looked at her mother's face. She looked at Reed on the floor. She didn't ask. She walked to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair, sat down, opened her bug notebook, and began to draw. The pencil moved over the paper steadily, slowly, careful lines from a child concentrating completely on each mark, and May realized that this was how her daughter handled the world when the world became too large and too complicated and too frightening to understand. She drew bugs. She always drew bugs, because bugs had rules, had names, had families, had classifications, and the world of bugs never had strange men lying on the floor, or bags of money on the kitchen table, or a mother standing in the middle of the room with a face Bree had never seen before. May looked at her daughter drawing, looked at Reed on the floor, looked at the leather bag on the table, and thought about $34 in her coat pocket at 16, and about everything she had built from those $34, and she thought that she had lost everything before, and built again. And if she had to, she would build again. But she would not lose Bree. Not because of this man, not because of his cousin, not because of anyone. She closed the leather bag, pushed it to the far corner of the table away from where Bree was sitting, and went back to folding laundry, because that was what she had been doing before the world changed, and she would keep doing it after it changed, because May Sullivan wasn't the kind of person who stopped when things fell apart. She was the kind of person who folded laundry. Bree fell asleep at 8 o'clock that night, her bug notebook folded over her chest, her pencil still in her hand, and May gently slipped the pencil free, pulled the blanket up to her daughter's shoulders, closed the bedroom door, then went back out to the front room and sat down at the kitchen table, because she wasn't sleepy and she knew she wouldn't sleep tonight. Not because she was afraid, but because her mind wouldn't stop running through what he had said that afternoon, running through the leather bag in the corner of the table, running through the sentence, if they find the car, they'll find the cabin, running through every possible scenario, and how she would get Bree out of here if she had to. Reed was awake too. He was always awake. He lay beside the fireplace with his eyes open, his breathing slow and steady, but not the breathing of a sleeping man, the breathing of someone controlling pain and not wanting anyone to know how bad it really was. The fire burned low, the light flickering across the wooden ceiling, and the cabin sank into the kind of silence that only exists in the middle of the night in a place miles from the nearest town, the kind of silence so heavy you can hear snow falling outside the window. May didn't know who spoke first. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was him. But at some point between 10 o'clock and midnight, silence became words. Not suddenly, not because someone decided to talk, but because the night did what the night always does to people who are awake inside the dark. It lowered the wall one brick at a time, until the distance between two people was no longer wide enough to hold silence any longer. "Why don't you call the police?" May said, not looking at him, her eyes on the glass of water on the table, her voice low, not quite a whisper but close, enough that it wouldn't carry through the bedroom door where Bree was sleeping. That question had been inside her since the afternoon, since the moment he said the name Paxton Shaw and said if they find the cabin, because the logical answer to every problem belonging to a man being hunted by his own cousin was to call the police and let the law handle it. And the fact that he hadn't done that meant either he couldn't or he wouldn't. And both possibilities told May more than anything he had volunteered on his own. Reed stayed quiet long enough that May thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, his voice rough, low, the ceiling in here low enough that his voice sounded as if he were right beside her, even though he lay 3 meters away. Because 3 of them work for Paxton. 6 words, no further explanation. He didn't say 3 who, 3 where, 3 names. Just 6 words and let the empty space speak for itself. May didn't ask anything else. She didn't need to. She had grown up in Montana's foster care system. She knew exactly what it felt like when the people being paid to protect you were the very people you needed protection from. She knew what it felt like when the system wasn't a safety net but a trap. And she knew that when 3 police officers worked for your enemy, the police weren't the solution, they were the problem. She knew that not because she had reasoned it out, but because she had lived it. And that knowledge sat still in her stomach like a stone she had swallowed long ago and never spat back out. Silence returned, longer this time, but different, a little lighter, as if the fact that she didn't ask another question had told him she understood, without needing it explained. And he realized that, and it shifted something between them that both of them felt, but neither one named. Then Reed asked, the first time he had asked her anything that wasn't about the wound, or the car, or the bag. "Why do you live here?" he said, his voice not curious, not judgmental. Only a question laid between them in the middle of the night, by a man lying on the floor of a woman he knew nothing about, except her name, and her cracked hands, and the fact that she wasn't afraid of him. Here, in the middle of nowhere, alone, with a child. "Because nobody finds us here," May said, and she surprised herself by answering. Because she hadn't meant to answer. Because no questions, no stories was her own rule and she had just broken it, but the answer had come out before she could stop it. Because it was too true. Too simple. Too exact. And sometimes a truth is so exact it doesn't need permission to be spoken. It just steps out on its own. Because nobody finds us here. 7 words, and Reed Callahan understood all of them. He understood that she didn't live here because she loved nature or wanted a simple life. She lived here because she was hiding. Not hiding from the Mafia, not hiding from the law, but hiding from everything. From the system, from people, from everything that had ever taken everything from her. And this cabin in Montana was the farthest place she could go while still giving Bree a roof. He understood because he was hiding too, only from a different kind of thing. And 2 people in hiding recognized each other in the middle of the night inside a cabin. Both of them were using to shelter from different versions of the same world, a world that had proven more than once that it wasn't on their side. May stood to get water because her throat was dry, and because she needed to move, needed to break the air that was growing heavier between the kitchen table and the fireplace, that air she didn't have a name for, but could feel on her skin, warmer than it should have been, closer than it should have been, dangerous in a way entirely different from guns and money and a traitorous cousin. She walked past where Reed was lying to reach the sink, and he caught her wrist. Not with a jerk, not by pulling, not tightly. He only laid his hand on her wrist, light, his fingers closing just enough to make her stop, and the heat from his hand passed into her skin, warmer than normal, because he had a slight fever. And she knew he had a slight fever, because she had checked his forehead when she gave him antibiotics, at 6 o'clock that evening, and his temperature had been a little high, but not high enough to worry her. But she wasn't thinking about the fever then. She was thinking about the hand on her wrist, about its weight, about its warmth, about the way his fingers fit around the bone of her wrist as if he had measured it first. And she stood still, didn't pull away, didn't look down, her eyes fixed straight ahead on the sink, and waited. "I won't let anything happen to the little girl," Reed said, his voice lower than before, closer because he was sitting directly below where she stood, and she could feel his breath touch the back of her hand. It wasn't a promise. He didn't promise. He stated it, the way he stated everything, like a fact he had decided, and there was no room left to negotiate. May slipped her hand free. Slowly. She didn't jerk, didn't yank, only slid her wrist from his fingers in the way that told both of them she could have torn free at any moment but had chosen not to. And the difference between those 2 things said more than any words could have. She kept walking to the sink, got water, drank it, didn't turn back, didn't say anything. And she didn't wipe her wrist. She didn't know why she noticed that she didn't wipe her wrist, but she noticed it, and she filed it away in the same drawer in her mind as the line in the book, and the ring with the engraving, and the way he listened when Bree talked about beetles, the drawer where she kept things she still didn't know what to do with but couldn't throw away. May lay in bed beside Bree, her eyes open to the dark ceiling, and her wrist was still warm where he had touched it, even though more than an hour had passed since she had slipped her hand free and gone into the bedroom and shut the door. And she hated that she was still thinking about it, hated that her body remembered the light touch of a strange man, as if it were something worth remembering when her mind knew perfectly well that there was nothing worth remembering here, except danger. But her mind wouldn't stop at her wrist. It ran backward, farther, deeper, toward the things she had buried carefully and rarely dug up. But tonight, for some reason, they rose on their own, layer by layer, like things buried under snow when the snow begins to melt. The third foster home. That was the place that taught May the most, though not in any way any child should ever be taught. The Thornton family on the outskirts of Billings. A house that looked respectable from the outside. White paint, wooden fence, pickup truck in the drive. The kind of house a social worker could glance at from the car window and mark approved without ever stepping out. The foster father was named Gerald Thornton, and the first thing May learned about him didn't come from his words, but from the lock on the kitchen cabinet. A number lock, 4 digits, and he was the only one who knew the code. And every meal was a transaction he controlled. How many slices of bread? How many spoonfuls of peanut butter? How many grams of cheese? All of it, measured, distributed, recorded in a small notebook he kept in the locked drawer of his desk. Not because he was poor. The Thorntons received foster payments for 3 children, and he also worked as a plumber, so money wasn't scarce. It was because he liked control, liked watching a 14-year-old child stand in front of a locked kitchen cabinet and know that the only power in this house lived inside 4 digits that child would never be allowed to know. May learned to count calories in that house, not from books or the internet, but from hunger, counting every calorie in every meal Gerald Thornton handed out so she could figure out whether she had enough energy to survive the day, counting how many calories were in 2 slices of white bread, how many in a tablespoon of peanut butter, how many in half a glass of milk. And when the total wasn't enough, she learned to walk more slowly to save energy, to sleep more so her body wouldn't burn calories, and to hide food when she could, a granola bar in her sleeve, an apple in her school bag. Survival skills no child should ever need, but May knew them, because May had no other choice. She stayed in the Thornton house for 2 years. She left at 16, not because a social worker intervened. They didn't. They never intervened soon enough. But because one February night, May woke at 3 o'clock in the morning, stuffed everything she owned into a torn nylon backpack, counted the money she had hidden inside the lining of her shoe for 4 months, $34, all in small bills, and walked out the back door while the whole house slept. She walked 7 miles to the Greyhound station and bought a ticket to Whitehall, because that was the farthest place $34 could take her. Everything May Sullivan had now. The cabin, the job, Bree, the calloused hands, the ability to survive anything. All of it had begun with those $34. Not a foundation, not startup money, but the line between staying and dying slowly in a house with a locked kitchen cabinet, and May had chosen to go, and she had built everything from ashes. Alone, 1 brick at a time. No one helped. No one asked her what she needed. And now, in the middle of the night, she lay in bed beside her daughter and thought about the man out in the front room, the man with the gun and the money and the scar and the book his mother had left him before she walked away. And she realized with a cold clarity that made her want to shut her eyes tight that they were alike. Not alike in circumstance. His circumstance was an empire, and hers had been $34. The difference between them so wide it was almost absurd, but alike in the way that both of them had built everything alone out of ruins other people had left behind. Both of them had trusted the wrong person exactly once, and decided never to repeat that mistake. Both of them lived by controlling everything around them, because losing control was the thing that had almost killed them. And both of them were lying awake in the same cabin in the middle of the night, for reasons more similar than either of them wanted to admit. May closed her eyes. She tried to sleep, and through the thin wall between the bedroom and the front room, she heard Reed's voice, not speaking to anyone, not talking in his sleep, but whispering, very softly, almost too softly to hear if the cabin hadn't been so quiet that she could hear even the snow touching the window glass. I should have seen it. Then again, I should have seen it. The voice of a man who had spent his whole life reading people, calculating every move, controlling every variable, and had missed the one variable that could kill him, the man he called family. May lay still, listening, and didn't open her eyes, and she thought that was the worst thing about being betrayed by someone you trusted. Not the pain, not the anger, but the question afterward, the question that repeats itself at 3 o'clock in the morning when no one is listening. I should have seen it. I should have known. And you never find an answer because the answer doesn't matter. Only the question remains, forever. And May knew that because she had her own version of that question, not about a cousin or the Mafia, but about her birth mother, about her foster father, about every person who had promised to stay and then didn't, and she had stopped asking a long time ago. But the question was still there, lying quiet at the bottom like a stone in her stomach. And tonight it felt heavier than usual, because someone in the next room was asking the same question too. On the morning of the third day, May woke before dawn as always, looked out the window, and saw that the snow was still falling, but more slowly, the wind weaker, the horizon beginning to separate from the sky, instead of melting into one blank white mass, the way it had 2 days earlier. And she knew the storm was easing even though it wasn't over. Maybe another day, maybe half a day, but the window of time was opening, and that was both good news and bad news, because if she could get out, other people could too. She gave Reed his antibiotics with half a bowl of porridge made from the last of the rice in the cabinet, checked the stitches in his side. The bandage was still clean, no sign of infection. Bonnie would come that afternoon to look at it again, but May needed supplies before then. The gauze was almost gone. The hydrogen peroxide was down to the bottom of the bottle, and the kitchen cabinet was thinning faster than usual, because she was feeding one full-grown man with stores meant for a mother and child. She put on her coat, pulled on her hat, turned to Bree, who was sitting at the kitchen table eating porridge, and said, "I'm going to Mr. Gus's store. You stay here, lock the door, don't open it for anyone except me and Bonnie." Bree nodded without looking up from her bowl. Ordinary, not asking why, not worried, because Bree was used to her mother leaving and coming back. That was the rhythm of their life, and May had taught her daughter very early that when Mom said stay home and lock the door, you stayed home and locked the door. Not because of fear, but because that was the rule, and rules kept people alive. May looked at Reed before she left. He looked back. Neither of them said anything, but that look held an agreement inside it. He wouldn't touch anything, and he wouldn't touch Bree, and May would be back within 2 hours, and both of them understood that without a single word, because they were the kind of people who could read an agreement in silence more clearly than on paper. 2 miles through snow took 45 minutes, and May's feet were wet to the ankles even in high boots, and when she pushed open the door to Gus Whitfield's general store, the bell above it rang into the warm little room that smelled of old coffee and machine oil and dry dog food. And Gus stood behind the counter, 68 years old, white-haired, his back slightly bent but his shoulders still broad, reading the newspaper through a pair of reading glasses balanced low on his nose, and at his feet, on the old rug beside the little stove, Colonel lay sleeping, three-legged, one eye clouded, barely moving when May came in, except for the lazy wag of his tail that Colonel gave everyone, because Colonel didn't have enough energy or interest for much more than that. May gathered what she needed quickly. No wandering, no choosing. She knew exactly where everything was in that store after 4 years. 2 rolls of gauze, a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, a bag of rice, canned beans, canned meat, bread, and she set it all on the counter in front of Gus. And Gus looked at the pile, then at May, then back at the pile, and he didn't need to ask why she was buying hydrogen peroxide and gauze in quantities. A 27-year-old woman living with her 6-year-old daughter would never need unless something had happened that shouldn't have happened. But before Gus said anything, May saw the landline on the wall behind the counter. The corded phone Gus kept because landlines still worked out here even when everything else died. And she realized this was the first chance, and maybe the only chance she would have to call someone. Call 911. Call the police. Call anyone. And say there was a wounded man with a gunshot lying on her floor, and she needed help. Gus saw her looking at the phone. He nodded toward it, meaning go ahead, and May walked around the counter, lifted the receiver, pressed it to her ear, heard the steady tone of a live line, and stood there. 3 minutes. She stood there for 3 minutes with the receiver against her ear and her finger above the number pad, and didn't press a single button. Because police meant questions. Questions meant reports. Reports meant the gun under the refrigerator, and the cash on the kitchen table, and a man with a gunshot wound inside a house where a 6-year-old child lived. And when you put those things together in the file of any agency, what happened next wasn't help. What happened next was Child Protective Services. People in clean shoes and pressed jackets, coming to her house with a folder and a home environment assessment form, and the authority to take Bree away while they investigated. Temporarily, they'd say. Just procedure, they'd say. But May had grown up in that system, and she knew exactly what temporary meant. Temporary meant 2 years in a stranger's house. Temporary meant locked kitchen cabinets, and counting calories, and waking at 3 o'clock in the morning in a room that wasn't yours. And May would rather die than let Bree enter that system. Rather die in the most literal sense. She set the receiver down. Turned back to the counter. Gus had stood there watching her the whole 3 minutes without saying a word, because Gus Whitfield was the kind of man who knew when to stay silent and when to speak, and he had chosen silence until now. "You've got trouble," Gus said. Not a question. His voice low and even. The voice of a man who had once been a police officer for 20 years and retired early because he'd gotten tired of the system, and now sold canned beans and dog food in a store in the middle of Montana, and didn't ask unnecessary questions. "Not my trouble," May said. Gus looked at the hydrogen peroxide, looked at the gauze, looked back at May. "You're buying hydrogen peroxide for trouble that isn't yours," he said. And in that sentence was everything Gus didn't say. That he knew, that he didn't judge, that he'd lived long enough to understand that sometimes trouble that isn't yours is still lying on your floor, and you don't have any choice except to pour hydrogen peroxide on it and hope it heals. Gus pushed the supplies toward May without touching the register. May opened her mouth to say something about the money, and Gus cut her off by lifting a hand, palm out, the universal gesture for don't say something foolish. Then he spoke again, his voice lower, graver, but not threatening, only an old man speaking to a young woman he cared about more than he'd ever admit. "I've still got the shotgun, if you need it." May picked up the supplies, packed them into the bag, nodded once and only once, then walked out without looking back. Because if she looked back, she'd have to admit that the look in Gus's eyes made her want to cry. And May Sullivan didn't cry. Not because she was strong, but because she didn't have the habit anymore. It had been taken out of her a long time ago, in a house with a locked kitchen cabinet, where no one had ever asked if she was all right. 2 miles home through the snow, faster than the walk there because the wind had changed direction. And when May pushed open the cabin door, the first sound she heard wasn't the fireplace or the wind, but Bree's voice, reading out loud, slow, stumbling, the voice of a child struggling with words bigger than her mouth. And May stood in the doorway, the supply bag still in her hand, and looked into the front room. Bree was sitting on the floor beside Reed, closer than the morning before, her shoulder almost resting against his arm, East of Eden open across her lap, and Bree was reading, 1 word at a time, 1 word at a time, and Reed lay against the wall with his eyes closed, not asleep. May knew he wasn't asleep because his breathing wasn't the breathing of sleep. His eyes closed, but his mouth slightly curved, not a smile, something nearer and smaller, the kind of curve a person's mouth makes when they're listening to something they didn't know they needed to hear until they heard it. May stood in the doorway, and something inside her chest tightened, not anger, not fear, but a cold, sharp, exact kind of recognition, like the edge of a blade. Bree was attaching. Her daughter, the child she had kept at exactly the distance from other people that she believed was safe for 6 years. He was sitting there with her shoulder pressed against a man who had enemies hunting him, and reading to him as if he were the safest person in the world. And May looked at that scene and knew it in the bone, that this was the most dangerous thing that had happened since she dragged him out of the car. More dangerous than the gun, more dangerous than the money, more dangerous than Paxton Shaw, because a gun she could hide, money she could return, enemies she could avoid. But once a child had begun to believe in someone, she couldn't pull that back. And when that person left, and he would leave, the wound he left behind wouldn't be in anyone's side. It would be inside her daughter's chest, where May couldn't stitch it shut. It happened around 3 in the afternoon. At first, May thought it was the wind, because winter wind in Montana could sound like almost anything. But then it grew clearer, steadier, the sound of an engine, not a car, lighter, higher, the sound of a snowmobile, and not one but two engines moving in parallel, coming closer from the direction of the main road. And May knew it wasn't rescue because rescue didn't travel in pairs. Rescue came in groups with lights and radios and county logos on the vehicles, and 2 snowmobiles moving side by side through a snowstorm out in this area, where there wasn't another house for miles, meant they were coming here. Reed heard it before she did, or maybe at the same moment but reacted faster because this was what he had been waiting for, what he had known would come, and he pushed himself upright from where he had been leaning against the wall, in one single movement that turned his face white with pain. But he didn't have time for pain. His eyes sharpened in a way May hadn't seen before, sharp like the eyes of a man stepping out of the role of the wounded and into something entirely different, and he said, his voice low, fast, not one word wasted, "They're here. Paxton sent 2, to confirm I'm dead." May had 3 seconds. She knew she had 3 seconds because the snowmobiles were at a distance she guessed to be half a mile. And at the speed they were moving over snow, she had about 3 minutes before they reached the yard, minus the time needed to do what had to be done, which left her 3 seconds to decide. 3 seconds wasn't long, but May Sullivan had made every important decision of her life in less time than that. The decision to run from the Thornton house had taken 2 seconds. The decision to keep Bree when the doctor asked if she wanted to consider other options had taken 1. And the decision to drag Reed out of the car in the storm had taken less than 3. So 3 seconds was enough. "Cellar," May said. She went straight to the rug that had been crooked ever since the first day when she dragged Reed into the cabin, pulled it all the way aside, and the cellar hatch was exposed. The wooden hatch with the rusted iron ring she had seen that first day and thought nothing of. And now she thought of it. Now it was the only thing she thought of. She pulled the ring, the hatch opened, and below was a small dark space, about 1.5 meters deep, dirt floor, no light, no ventilation, enough room for one man to lie down if he could stand darkness and tightness and pain. Reed didn't need to be told twice. He took the leather bag from the corner of the table, where May had left it, and lowered himself into the cellar with one hand, because the other was pressed against his side, which had started bleeding again through the bandage, because sitting up so fast had probably torn at least 1 stitch loose. And he lay down on the dark dirt floor without a word, his eyes looking up at May standing over the opening and looking down at him. And in the firelight rising across his face, May saw something she hadn't expected. Not fear. Reed Callahan didn't look like a man who knew fear, but trust. Complete. Absolute. He was placing his life in the hands of a woman he had known for 2 days, and he did it without hesitation. And May didn't know whether she deserved that kind of trust, but she shut the hatch, pulled the rug back over it, and turned toward the bedroom. Bree was standing in the doorway, eyes wide, bug notebook in her hands. Silent. She had heard the snowmobiles and heard her mother's voice, and heard the hatch open, and she didn't ask anything, because Bree Sullivan was 6 years old, but had already learned that when Mom moved fast and spoke short, you didn't ask, you obeyed. "Into the room, shut the door, get on the bed, don't come out until I call you," May said. And Bree went in and shut the door, and May heard the bed creak softly as her daughter climbed onto it, and May turned back toward the front room, with an expression that took her 1 second to arrange. An ordinary expression, the face of a woman having an ordinary afternoon in a cabin in the middle of a snowstorm. She sat down at the kitchen table, took a ball of yarn and a pair of knitting needles from the basket beside the chair. The knitting she worked on every night after Bree fell asleep, not because she liked knitting, but because yarn was cheap, and Bree needed a new scarf, and May didn't have the money to buy one, and she began to knit, slow, steady, calm, as if nothing in the world mattered more than a single stitch. And when the snowmobiles shut off outside in the yard, when the sound of heavy boots came across the snow toward the wooden steps, when the knock came at the door, 3 knocks, even, unhurried, the kind of knock that belonged to men who knew the person inside had no choice but to open it. May set down the needles, stood, and went to the door, and opened it with the face of a poor single mother, living in the middle of nowhere. A little afraid, because strangers were knocking in the middle of a storm, and that wasn't a false face, it was her real one. She had only stripped away the part that wasn't afraid, the dangerous part, the part that had hidden a gun under the refrigerator, and dragged a man through the snow and stood for 3 minutes beside a telephone without calling because she knew the system wasn't her friend. She stripped all those parts away, and kept only the part the 2 men outside wanted to see. 2 men. The one in front was tall, broad, with a smooth, blank face, the kind of face paid to show nothing, heavy coat, hands in his pockets. The one behind him was smaller, leaner, his eyes moving quickly, sweeping over May and then sweeping over the space behind her inside the cabin, the kind of sweep May recognized at once, because she had seen Reed do the same thing when he woke up, and the recognition turned her stomach cold. but her face didn't change. "Hello, ma'am," the man in front said, his voice polite enough to sound false. "We're looking for a missing vehicle on the road. The driver may be injured, may be dangerous. Have you seen anything unusual in the last few days?" May stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, not inviting them in, not shutting the door, just standing on the line between open enough to be polite and closed enough to make herself clear. "I haven't gone outside in the storm," she said, her voice smaller than usual, trembling a little, not a real tremble, but one she placed there because a woman living alone with a small child would tremble a little when two strange men knocked in the middle of a winter afternoon. And if she didn't, that would be the strange thing. "My daughter's only 6. We've been inside the whole time." The man in back, the one with the fast-moving eyes, looked over May's shoulder into the cabin, and his eyes stopped at the kitchen table. And May knew exactly what he was seeing before she even turned her head, because she remembered, with a flash of cold through her whole body, that she had forgotten to wash the second coffee cup. 2 cups on the table, one for her, one for Reed, from that morning. And she had forgotten because she had been busy buying supplies at Gus's store, and when she came home she had been distracted by Bree reading to Reed. And now those 2 cups sat on the kitchen table like silent witnesses she couldn't silence. "You live alone," the man in back said. Not a question, his voice flat, his eyes still on the 2 cups. May didn't look in the direction of his gaze because following it would be admitting the cups meant something. And she said, her voice still lightly trembling, still in character, "My daughter's 6. She drinks hot cocoa." The lie came out smooth, quick, without a catch. And it was the best lie May had ever told, because it was almost true. Bree did drink hot cocoa sometimes. Just not this morning and not from that cup, but these 2 men didn't know that. And May said it with enough natural exhaustion of a single mother explaining something dull that the listener wouldn't want to keep asking. The man in front nodded, thanked her, apologized for disturbing her, said if she saw anything to call the county sheriff's office, and he turned away, and the man behind him turned away too, and they walked back across the yard, climbed onto the snowmobiles, started the engines, and the sound carried away, and May stood in the doorway watching them until they disappeared into the snow. But just before they vanished completely, the man in back, the one with the fast-moving eyes, looked back. Only once. Quick, he looked at the cabin, then turned away. May shut the door, dropped the latch, stood with her back against the door, both hands hanging at her sides, closed her eyes, and breathed out for the first time since the knocking had started. She knew. She knew with the kind of certainty that needed no proof, only instinct, that the man in back would return. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he would return, because of the 2 coffee cups, because that was the only mistake she had made, and for a man like him, one mistake was enough. Reed came up from the cellar with blood seeping through the bandage on his left side, and dirt from the floor clinging to the back of his shirt, and the face of a man who had just lain in darkness, listening to the boots of the men hunting. Him passed directly over his head, and he said nothing about it, didn't ask what they had said. Didn't ask whether they had believed her. He only looked at May, and May looked back. And between them, there was the understanding that both of them already knew the answer to those questions without asking. Bonnie arrived at 5 o'clock as promised, stitched the torn seam back up, changed the dressing, checked his fever, said little, watched a great deal, and left before full dark without asking about the 2 snowmobile tracks in the snow outside the yard that she had certainly seen. Bree ate dinner, took her bath, and fell asleep at 8. Her bug notebook on the pillow as it was every night. And when the bedroom door closed and the cabin sank into the heavy silence of the 3rd night, Reed said, "I need to show you something." And he opened the leather bag and took out the sealed envelope. May had seen the day before, but had not opened, because it wasn't hers. And her rule was no questions, no stories, even though that rule had now shattered into more pieces than she wanted to admit. He tore the envelope open with his thumb, carefully, as if what was inside was worth more than the envelope could hold, and emptied the contents onto the kitchen table. May looked. Papers, many of them, printed and handwritten, arranged in groups with paper clips. Photographs, 5 or 6, printed on ordinary paper, grainy, taken from a distance, taken in secret. 2 men shaking hands in a parking lot, a white van with no plates parked beside a warehouse, a table in a restaurant with 3 men sitting there, none of them familiar to May except Paxton Shaw in the middle, that smile too wide. The same smile she had already seen in the photograph from the leather bag. Call records, many pages, phone numbers marked in yellow highlighter, dates, durations, some of the calls lasting more than an hour, bank statements, not from an American bank, names of foreign countries May didn't recognize, numbers with more digits than anything she had ever seen in her life outside the evening news. And finally, at the very bottom, a single sheet of paper, handwritten, small, crowded, as if it had been written across many nights, by a man trying to press everything he knew into one page. May didn't read all of it. She didn't need to. She had spent 20 years reading papers, lease agreements, job applications, foster care forms, Bree's birth certificate, every piece of paper a lesson in how systems worked and who they served, and she looked at the pile on the table and understood its nature, even without understanding every detail. This was evidence. This was 4 years of one man's life compressed into an envelope. Reed sat across from her at the kitchen table, the first time he had sat in a chair instead of lying on the floor, and he began to speak. Not in the way people tell stories, not in the way people confide, but in the way people report, one fact at a time, exact, brief, as if he were presenting testimony before a trial he knew would never take place. Paxton Shaw, his cousin, the son of his father's sister, had conspired with the Vega Cartel, a drug organization operating along the Montana and Canada border, to seize control of the Callahan Empire. The call records were between Paxton and Vega's contact. The bank statements were money moving from Vega into the offshore accounts Paxton had opened under a false identity. The photographs were transactions Reed had paid someone to follow for 2 years and capture. And the handwritten page at the bottom was the most important thing. The timeline Reed had assembled across 4 years. Every date, every event, every connection, all of it leading back to one night 4 years earlier when his father, Frank Callahan, died at the dinner table in his own home, poisoned, and the medical examiner ruled it natural causes, because Frank was 63 and had a history of heart trouble, and no one asked for a second autopsy, because no one suspected anything, no one except Reed, who had sat beside his father's hospital bed and watched him die, and hadn't cried, not because he wasn't in pain, but because he had chosen to count instead of cry. Count who benefited when Frank died. Count who had access to Frank's food that night. Count who changed their behavior in the week before the funeral. Who made more calls than usual. Who met with whom. Who went where. He counted for 4 years, Reed said, his voice neither shaking nor rising nor dropping below normal. So flat it was almost frightening because it told May he had told this story to himself thousands of times, until every emotion had been worn away and only the facts remained. 4 years he had counted, and in the end every number led back to the same name. Paxton, his cousin, the boy he had grown up with, played with as a child, sat beside every year at Thanksgiving. Paxton had killed his father to take the empire his father had built, and when that wasn't fast enough because Reed was still standing in the way, Paxton had sold him to the Vega Cartel to clear the road completely. Reed stopped talking. The silence in the cabin was heavier than at any time in the last 3 days. Heavier even than the silence in the night when he had held her wrist, because this was the kind of silence that comes after someone opens a door that can't be shut again. May looked at the papers on the table, then looked at Reed, and she thought about his father, a man whose face she had never known, a man who built an empire out of blood and dirty money, and she didn't pity him. She had no reason to pity a mafia boss who died at his own dinner table. But she understood something Reed hadn't said aloud, though it was there in every page on that table, in the 4 years of counting, in the way he said my father would never leave me, the only 5 words in his entire cold report that weren't flat, 5 words carrying a different weight, and May understood, because she knew exactly the value of a person who doesn't leave in a world where everyone leaves. She knew because she had never had that person. Then she looked at East of Eden on the table beside the papers, and she thought about the line inside the cover, the letter M, and she didn't ask, but Reed followed her eyes and knew what she was thinking because he read people, and she was the only person in the last 2 days he hadn't been able to read completely. But this time she had let enough show. My mother, Reed said, and his voice changed for the first time. Not much, only half a tone, but enough for May to hear it. She left when I was 10. That's the only thing she left. A book and a line telling him to remember there were things worth building, not just breaking. Written by a woman who had left her son behind with a mafia boss and walked away without ever coming back. And Reed had read that book 4 times and was still trying to understand what she had meant. And May thought that maybe she hadn't meant anything except goodbye. But she didn't say that because there are truths too cruel to speak even when they're true. She understood. She understood not through logic but through bone. Because she had her own version of that story too. Not a book and a line, but $34 in the back door at 3 a.m. The only things she carried when she left the place that had tried to kill her slowly. And both of them had built their lives from something small, another person left behind. A book. $34. And both of them knew that small thing wasn't a gift. It was a scar. Reed spoke again, and his voice went flat once more, went controlled once more, as if the half-softened tone from a moment ago had been a mistake, and he was correcting it. You deserve to know why you shouldn't have saved me. May looked at him, looked at the papers, looked at the book, looked back at him, and she said, not loud, not soft, in her own voice, not performed, not held back, not shaking, too late. 2 words, and inside those 2 words was everything May Sullivan didn't say. That she had dragged him out of the car, hidden the gun, called Bonnie, lied to the 2 men on the snowmobiles, hidden him beneath her floor, and couldn't take any of it back, not because she didn't want to, but because May Sullivan wasn't the kind of person who did something halfway and then stopped. She was the kind of person who went all the way to the end, whatever the end turned out to be, because that was how she had survived from $34 until now. And he, whoever he was, however dangerous his world might be, had entered her equation the moment she dragged him through the snow, and too late was the only truth she could say, without having to explain anything else. May woke on the 4th day and knew before she opened her eyes that the storm was over because the silence was different. Not the heavy silence of the past 3 days, but a lighter silence. The silence of no wind, and when she looked out the window, the sky was still gray, but the snow had stopped falling, and she could see the tree line at the edge of the yard, every branch clear, for the first time in 4 days, and that meant the roads would start being cleared within the next few hours, and that meant everything was about to change. Reed had been awake before her, as he had been every day, but today he wasn't sitting against the wall watching the door. He was at the kitchen table with the burner phone from the leather bag set in front of him, waiting for a signal. She saw the exact moment the signal came because his eyes changed, dropped to the screen, and then lifted to her. Quick, and he dialed without looking anything up, because the number lived in his head, and she guessed that his head was the safest place to keep important things when everything else could be taken away. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Reed said little and listened more, and when he hung up, there was something on his face May hadn't seen in the last 4 days, not relief. Reed Callahan didn't look like a man who knew relief, but confirmation, the face of someone who had just learned that one piece was still alive on the board when he had thought it was gone. Finn, he said, the name he had whispered half-conscious on the first day when May dragged him through the snow. Alive. Safe house in Great Falls. Sending people to pick me up. 6 hours. May stood at the sink with a coffee cup in her hand, and she calculated. 6 hours. Great Falls was about 3 hours from Whitehall in normal road conditions, maybe 4 or 5 in snow. Finn's people would need 6 hours to get here or to reach a meeting point somewhere in between, and 6 hours was time May didn't have, because in her gut, her instinct, the thing that had kept her alive since she was 16 with $34, was telling her that the lean man with the quick scanning eyes on the snowmobile yesterday would come back before 6 hours were up. She had no proof. She didn't need proof. She had 4 years of living alone in the woods, and 16 years before that of living in houses where instinct was the only thing worth trusting. And instinct told her that the 2 coffee cups on the table yesterday had bought her a measure of suspicion in that man's mind, and that measure of suspicion would bring him back to check, not because he was certain, but because he wasn't. And men like that can't tolerate uncertainty. May set her cup down. She looked at Reed. I'll drive, she said. It wasn't an offer. It wasn't a question. She said it the way she said everything important, flat, brief, final, leaving no room for argument. I have a truck. She drives. He goes with her. They meet Finn's people somewhere on the road. Done. Reed opened his mouth, and May knew what he was about to say. That he was about to say no. About to say she shouldn't get pulled in any deeper. About to say something about danger and responsibility, and the fact that she had a child to protect. But he looked at her face and stopped, because he had learned enough in 4 days to know that there was no place for the word no on that face. Bree comes too, May said, because May never left Bree behind alone. Not for 1 minute. Not under any circumstance. That was the first rule and the last rule and the one that couldn't be broken, and Reed nodded. because he understood rules that couldn't be broken. She put Bree's coat on her, settled the child into the back seat of the 2004 pickup that she started by giving the front left panel a small kick and then turning the key exactly twice, a trick she had learned after hundreds of cold mornings. And Reed sat in the passenger seat with the leather bag on his lap, his face white because every jolt through the snow struck the cracked ribs. But he didn't complain. He wasn't the kind of man who complained. May drove past Gus's store. She didn't shut off the engine. She stepped inside, quick, Gus standing behind the counter as always, Colonel lying at his feet as always, and she said, "If anyone asks, I'm taking Bree to the doctor in Butte." Gus looked at her, then out the window, at the pickup idling in the yard, at the shadow of the man in the front seat, at the smaller shadow of Bree in the back, and he understood more than May said, because Gus Whitfield was 68 years old and had once been a police officer for 20 years, and he knew when a woman was running, even if she called it taking her child to the doctor. He nodded. One slow, heavy nod. The nod of a man handing something over to someone else, when he wasn't entirely at peace with it but knew he had no right to stop her. Then he spoke, and his voice shook. Shook for real. Not from the cold or from age, but from a reason May recognized at once, and had to turn her face away from, because she couldn't bear seeing it. She couldn't bear someone worrying about her. She wasn't used to that. She didn't know what to do with it. "Colonel's gonna miss the little one," Gus said. And inside that sentence was everything he didn't say. "Be careful. Come back. I'm worried about you. I'm worried about Bree." But Gus was the kind of man who didn't say those things plainly, because he had been raised in Montana, and Montana men don't say, "I'm worried about you." They say Colonel's gonna miss the little one, and hope the person listening understands. May understood. She stepped back outside, climbed into the truck, shut the door, and drove out to the main road heading north toward Great Falls, without looking back at the small warm store that smelled of old coffee and machine oil, where an old man stood behind the counter, watching her pickup disappear into the snow. "Road," and at his feet Colonel wagged his tail once, and then went back to sleep, because Colonel didn't know that the child he loved most in the world had just driven away in a truck, heading towards something that Colonel, with his 3 legs and 1 clouded eye and his ridiculous fear of cats, had no way of understanding. The road from Whitehall to Great Falls hadn't been fully cleared. The county snowplow had only opened a single lane, and the pavement underneath was still slick. The salt hadn't had time to bite in yet, and May's 2004 pickup rattled at every joint and groaned at every seam, and the heater worked only well enough to keep them from freezing, but not well enough to make them warm, and May drove with both hands locked on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road, not speaking, because speaking was a distraction, and this road didn't allow distractions. Reed sat in the passenger seat with the leather bag on his lap, his left hand pressed to the bandaged side of his ribs, his face going white every time the truck hit a pothole or a ridge of frozen snow. But he said nothing about the pain. He looked in the right side mirror more than he looked at the road ahead, because he wasn't worried about the road. He was worried about what might come from behind. Bree sat in the back seat, buckled in, her bug notebook on her left thigh, East of Eden on her right, and she was quiet in the way. She was only quiet when she knew this wasn't the time to talk, and May glanced at her daughter in the rearview mirror and saw Bree staring out at the white blur of snow, sliding past the windows with the calm, wide eyes of a child who had learned to read the air before she learned to read words. They had been driving about an hour and 45 minutes, more than halfway there, in the stretch through the Missouri Valley where the road cut across a flat open expanse with no trees, when May saw them. 3 vehicles, parked across the road. Not rescue, not police. 3 black SUVs. The kind of vehicles ordinary people in Montana didn't drive. The kind of vehicle May had dragged a man out of 4 days earlier, and she knew before she stopped the truck, knew before she saw anyone's face, knew with her gut and not her eyes, that this was the thing her instincts had warned her about, the thing she had known would come before 6 hours were up. Only it had come here, in the middle of the road, in broad daylight, in a place where there was nothing but snow and a gray sky. She stopped the truck. There was no other choice. The road was blocked completely. The 3 SUVs arranged in an upside-down V, and the only way through would have been to drive down into the fields on either side, and her pickup didn't have the clearance for that. Reed saw them at the same moment, and his whole body changed. Not in a large movement, just in the way everything in him tightened, shoulders straightening, jaw hardening, eyes narrowing, and his right hand moved by reflex toward his hip, where May guessed something had once lived, but didn't anymore, because she had hidden it under the refrigerator 4 days ago. The door of the middle SUV opened and a man stepped out, and May recognized him from the photograph in the leather bag. A face that resembled Reed's but softer, slicker, a smile too wide for his eyes. Except this time he wasn't smiling. He looked at her beat-up old pickup with an expression half curious and half contemptuous. The face of a man used to expensive things trying to understand why his cousin was sitting inside this one. Paxton Shaw, 35 years old, leather jacket, hands out of his pockets, standing in the middle of the white road as if the road belonged to him, and 2 other men stepped out of the other SUVs and took positions on either side of him. And May recognized one of them as the one with the quick scanning eyes from yesterday, Perry, and she had been right. He had come back, only not to the cabin, back here, in the middle of the road, where there was no cellar to hide anyone in. May killed the engine. She looked in the rearview mirror. Bree was in the back seat, eyes wide, not crying, both arms wrapped around the bug notebook against her chest. She looked at Reed, and his eyes had shifted into a kind she hadn't seen in the last 4 days. Cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who had given orders to kill and had sat and watched them carried out. And May realized for the first time, truly realized, that the man sitting beside her wasn't only Paxton Shaw's victim, he was Reed Callahan, and Reed Callahan was the thing hired killers were afraid of. But today Reed Callahan had cracked ribs, a gunshot wound stitched twice, no weapon, and couldn't stand up without nearly falling. May opened the truck door and stepped out. Not because she was brave, not because she had a plan, but because her daughter was in that truck, and her daughter was 6 years old, and May Sullivan would stand between Bree and anything in this world that wanted to come near her, whether it was a blizzard or a locked kitchen cabinet or 3 black SUVs across the road. She would stand there because that was the only thing she knew how to do, the only thing she was good at, putting her own body between her daughter and the world. She stood in the road, between Paxton Shaw and the pickup, the cold wind hitting her face, hair whipping, her coat thinner than it should have been, and she said, her voice not shaking, not this time, her real voice, May Sullivan's voice with no roll in it at all. My 6-year-old daughter is in that truck. Paxton Shaw looked at her. He didn't look at her long, maybe 2 seconds. But May read those 2 seconds, read the calculation in them, read that he was weighing the fact that this was a public road, daylight, cars could come through at any moment. The county plows were working this stretch, and killing his cousin was family business he could manage, but killing a woman and a 6-year-old child on a public road in broad daylight in Montana was the kind of thing the FBI didn't ignore, and the press didn't forget. And Paxton Shaw was the smart kind of dangerous, not the stupid kind, and smart, dangerous men know when the price is too high. He hesitated. 1 second, that second was all May needed. Not because she had a plan for the next one, but because the next second arrived on its own, in the form of engines, coming from behind, 2 vehicles moving fast on the road, and May didn't turn to look, but she saw Paxton's eyes change, saw his attention shift from her to whatever was behind her. And she knew before she heard the vehicles stop that it was Finn, the man Reed had called that morning, the man alive in the safe house in Great Falls. And Finn had come early because Finn had instincts too, the kind of instincts that belonged to a man who had lived in this world long enough to know that 6 hours was too slow when your enemy already knew where you were. 2 vehicles, 6 men, taking positions behind May, on both sides of her pickup. And May stood in the middle, between the 2 sides, a 27-year-old woman in a thin coat on a snow-covered road between 2 forces she belonged to neither of. A standoff. Silence. No one drew a gun because there were too many people, too close to the road, too much daylight. And Paxton Shaw looked past May toward the pickup, where he knew Reed was sitting, and he knew today wasn't the day. And he stepped back once, then twice, then turned and started toward his SUV. And before he got in, he stopped, turned back, and looked at May, not Reed, not Finn, May, and said in a light, courteous voice, the kind of courtesy May recognized at once as a threat, because she had heard that tone from foster fathers who knew how to hit without leaving marks. I'll remember your face. May looked back at him. Good, she said. 1 word. And in that word there was no challenge, no bravado, no performance, only the truth that May Sullivan had been threatened by people better than Paxton Shaw before Paxton Shaw knew how to hold his first gun, and she was still standing here, and that was all she needed to say. The 3 black SUVs turned around and drove off. May stood in the middle of the road watching them disappear. wind blowing powdered snow around her boots, and when the last vehicle vanished beyond the bend, the passenger door opened and Reed stepped out. He almost fell. May saw his knees buckle and his hand catch the side of the truck, and his face go white enough to shade toward green. But he straightened again through pure will. The kind of will she recognized because she had it too. The kind of will that keeps you standing when your body wants to fold because you have already folded too many times, and you don't do it anymore. He looked at her. "You shouldn't have stepped out like that," he said. May looked back. "Don't tell me what I should do," she said, and her voice was ordinary, as if she had just said something about the weather, and she turned toward the truck because her legs had started to shake, and she didn't want him to see it. Not out of pride, but because she wasn't ready for anyone to see her shake. She had shaken alone her whole life, and she would keep shaking alone. She opened the driver's door, and before she got in, Bree's voice came from the back seat. Small, clear, calm, in a way that felt almost unreal, because she had been sitting there the whole time, had looked through the glass. He had seen her mother step out and stand in the road in front of men she didn't know, but knew were dangerous, because Bree was 6 years old and could read the air better than most grown people. "Mom," Bree said, her arms wrapped around the bug notebook against her chest, her big eyes fixed on May through the mirror. "You're really brave." May slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, both hands settling on the steering wheel, and something rose in her chest. Hot, sharp, not anger, not fear, but something she didn't have a name for. Something she had buried very deep for a very long time, because no one had ever said to her what Bree had just said. Not in that voice, not with those eyes, not with that kind of absolute trust, and she almost cried. Almost. Her eyes burned and her throat closed, and she felt it right behind her breastbone. But she didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because she had forgotten how. Because no one had ever taught her that crying could be safe. Because every time she cried as a child there had been consequences, and her body had learned that tears were never free. And now even when she wanted to cry, her body wouldn't allow it. And she swallowed it back down, like swallowing a stone, then started the truck and kept driving. The warehouse sat on the edge of Great Falls, about half a mile off the main road, down a dirt track May almost missed because the sign had snapped in half and the rest was buried under snow. But Reed said turn left, and she turned, and the old pickup jolted over the frozen ruts, until a warehouse came into view, large, with a rusted tin roof, its sliding door half open, and parked in front of it were 2 vehicles May recognized from earlier on the road. Finn's vehicles, and beside them stood a man waiting, 40 years old, hair clipped short, shoulders broad, a face that looked as if it had been punched many times in life, and never once changed its mind about anything. And when the pickup stopped, that man walked straight to the passenger side, opened the door, and looked at Reed, and on his face was something May recognized at once, even though she had never seen it on anyone's face for anyone else. It was relief, the deep kind of relief people only feel when they have already braced themselves for the worst news, and the worst news doesn't come. Finn said nothing except Reed's name. Said it once, quietly, then helped him out of the truck by sliding a shoulder under his right arm, gentle in a way that was startling for a man that size. And May stood beside the truck looking at those 2 men, and understood that whatever lay between them wasn't boss and soldier. It was something else, something deeper, the kind of thing built out of years and blood and nights May knew nothing about, but could still guess at. Finn propped Reed against the side of the truck, turned to May, studied her for 3 seconds with the assessing eyes of a man used to judging threats, then gave one short nod, as if she had just passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. Then Finn went into the warehouse to get things ready, and left Reed and May and Bree standing outside in the cold wind. And May knew this was the moment of parting, even though no one said the word. She knew because Reed was looking at her the way people look before they leave, the kind of look that tries to remember. And she knew because the leather bag was no longer on her passenger seat. It was in Finn's hand now, and everything that belonged to Reed Callahan was being moved out of her orbit piece by piece. Reed turned to Bree. He didn't bend down. He knelt, one knee in the snow, and that movement cost him a great deal, because of the cracked ribs and the gunshot wound that had been stitched twice. But he did it anyway, and May saw the meaning in that anyway, saw the price he paid to kneel level with a 6-year-old child instead of talking down to her from above, and she filed it away in the drawer she had opened for him in her mind, the drawer that was getting fuller even though she didn't want it to. "The book," Reed said, and Bree looked down at East of Eden, which she was holding against her chest with both arms. The book she had picked up from the back seat of his car on the first day, and carried into the cabin and read aloud to him every morning, even though she didn't understand all of it, but loved the rhythm of the words, and Bree held it tighter because she thought he wanted it back. "Keep it," Reed said. Bree looked up, wide-eyed. "But your mom gave it to you," Bree said. And that sentence held everything a 6-year-old child understood about value. That the one thing your mother leaves before she walks away isn't something you give to someone else. It's something you keep, because it is the only proof that she ever existed in your life. And Bree understood that at 6, not because she was unusually wise, but because she had grown up with a mother who would drag a stranger through the snow and stand in front of guns to protect her child. And when you have a mother like that, you understand the value of someone's presence, and you understand the value of someone's absence. "And now I'm giving it to you," Reed said. And his voice didn't shake because Reed Callahan didn't shake. But there was something in his eyes that May saw from 3 steps away. Something wet, quick, fleeting, maybe the wind, maybe not the wind, and she didn't look too long because she knew he didn't want to be seen like that. Bree looked at her mother. May nodded, so slightly it was almost invisible. But Bree saw it, because Bree always saw her mother. That was the superpower of a child who only had one person in the world. She could read her mother across distances. No one else could read at all. Bree hugged the book more tightly and said thank you, small and serious. And Reed stood again, slowly, painfully, one hand gripping the truck. And then he looked at May. The silence between them lasted longer than it should have, and shorter than it needed to. Because some things need more than a few seconds between a warehouse and cold wind to be said, but neither of them was the kind of person who said those things. Both of them were the kind who placed everything into silence and hoped the other person could hear it there. "Paxton won't find you," Reed said. "I'll finish this before he gets the chance." May looked at him, and she thought about every promise she had ever heard in her life. From her birth mother, from social workers, from foster fathers, from Bree's father, each promise beautiful when spoken and broken when needed. And she had stopped believing promises a long time ago, because promises were the cheapest thing in the world. Anybody could afford them. Anybody could walk away from them. "Don't promise what you aren't sure you can keep," May said. Reed looked at her, and he didn't smile. He didn't soften. He didn't do any of the things men in movies do when they want a woman to believe them. He only looked at her with the same eyes she had seen scan a room when he woke, and look over evidence on her kitchen table, and fix on Paxton Shaw on the road. Eyes that didn't lie the way his mouth knew how to lie. And he said, "I don't promise. I tell the truth." Then he turned away, and Finn was there with his shoulder under Reed's arm, helping him toward the vehicle. And Reed Callahan got into that vehicle without looking back, and May knew he didn't look back, not because he didn't want to, but because looking back would mean admitting there was something behind him worth turning for, and he wasn't ready to admit that, just as she wasn't ready to admit that she wanted him to come back. The vehicle drove away, faded down the snowy road, disappeared around the bend. May stood in the yard of that abandoned warehouse outside Great Falls, the cold wind cutting through her thin coat, and Bree stood beside her, one small cold hand tucked into her mother's, east of Eden in the other, and the two of them stood there until there was nothing left to see but the white road stretching straight into the horizon. May drove home. 3 hours on the road, the pickup rattling and groaning, Bree asleep in the back seat with the book held in her lap, and May drove in silence and told herself that this was a detour. Not her life. Her life was the cabin, the gas station, Bree, the night shift, knitting scarves out of cheap yarn, counting every dollar, counting every day, building one brick at a time alone, the way she always had. That man, that world, the bag of cash, the envelope of evidence, the traitorous cousin, none of it belonged to her. It was 4 days, one storm, one name she would forget. She would go back to her cabin, lock the door, wash the blood off the floor, and keep living as if none of it had ever happened. Because that was what May Sullivan did best. Keep going, always keep going, through everything. The way she had kept going through $34 and a back door at 3 a.m. and every single thing after that. She almost believed it. Almost. But her wrist still remembered where he had touched it, and her ears still remembered his voice saying, "I don't promise. I tell the truth." And her eyes still remembered the way he had knelt down to Bree's level to give her the only thing his mother had left him. And May Sullivan drove that old pickup back toward the cabin in Montana through the gray afternoon and tried to forget. And she almost managed it. Almost. 2 weeks later, the burner phone on the kitchen table vibrated. and May looked at it for 10 seconds before picking it up because she knew who that phone belonged to, and anything that came from that world brought with it the very thing she had spent the last 14 days trying to forget. But she answered, and the voice on the other end was Finn, not Reed. Finn said 3 sentences. Reed is safe. Paxton is being isolated inside the organization. Keep this phone. Then he hung up, and May put the phone into the drawer of the bedside table. Didn't throw it away, didn't turn it off, only put it in and closed the drawer and went to wash the dishes, because the dishes needed washing. And May Sullivan wasn't the kind of person who sat staring at a drawer and thinking about what was inside it. 6 weeks later, she was standing in line at the register in Walmart in Butte, buying winter boots for Bree, when she saw it on the television mounted high on the wall above the customer service desk. The news: FBI raids a warehouse in Spokane, Washington. Arrests multiple suspects tied to a cross-border money laundering and drug trafficking operation. And Paxton Shaw's name appeared on the screen beneath charges of money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and collusion with a transnational criminal organization. And May stood there, a pair of children's size 11 boots in her hand, looking at Paxton Shaw's face on the television, that wide smile that never reached his eyes, and she felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, not fear, only the sense that one chapter had closed and she could step into the next one, even though she didn't yet know what the next one was. 4 months later, the trial took place in federal court. Reed did not appear in public. His handwritten 47-page statement was read in court by his attorney, and Paxton Shaw was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison with no early release. And May knew that because Finn called again, on the same phone in the drawer, with the same 3 short sentences, Paxton got 35 years. Reed says thank you. Take care of yourself. And then he hung up, and May put the phone back in the drawer, and this time she stood looking at the closed drawer longer than she wanted to admit before going to cook dinner. Life returned to its old shape, or almost its old shape. May worked the night shift at the gas station. Bree went to the small public school in town, sat next to a 7-year-old girl named Josie, Bonnie Pruitt's daughter, and the 2 children became best friends, the way children become best friends, quickly, completely, without conditions. And Josie had a cat named Bree, had her stories of Colonel. And between those 2 animals, there was enough material for the girls to talk through every lunch hour without ever running out. May finished knitting Bree's scarf. May fixed the leaking pipe under the kitchen sink. May paid the rent on time for the 48th month in a row. May kept going. The burner phone stayed in the drawer. It didn't ring. It didn't light up. May didn't throw it away, because throwing it away would mean admitting it mattered enough to need throwing away. And she didn't use it because using it would mean admitting she wanted to hear someone's voice on the other end. So it stayed there between the paperback she was halfway through reading and Bree's box of hair clips, existing without being acknowledged, like many other things in May's life. Then one late autumn night she was cleaning the kitchen after dinner and decided to wipe the floor beneath the refrigerator because it had been a long time and dust had built up thick under there. And when she knelt and slid the rag into the gap between the floor and the bottom of the appliance, her fingers touched a piece of paper, small, folded in half, not her paper, and she pulled it out and opened it and recognized the handwriting, rough, slanted, written in haste, written in pain or fever or both. Reed's writing. $34. The little girl told me, and beneath that, a string of numbers, a bank account number, no bank name, no account holder's name, just numbers. May sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the refrigerator, the scrap of paper in her hand, and stared at it for a long time. He had asked Bree, at some point during those 4 days, while May was buying supplies at Gus's, or while May was asleep, or while May had her back turned, Bree had told him about the $34, because Bree told everything to the people she trusted, and she had trusted him, and he had listened, and he had written this note, and tucked it beneath the refrigerator, beside the place where May had hidden his gun, in the one place only May would ever find it, and he had left her enough money to live 10 years without counting every dollar, without the night shift, without ever counting calories again. May looked at the line of numbers. She thought about $34 in her coat pocket at 16. She thought about every dollar she had earned since then, every one of them with cracked hands and night shifts, and counting every cent. She folded the note again, put it into the drawer beside the burner phone, closed the drawer, stood up, and cooked dinner. She didn't withdraw the money, not because she didn't need it, She did. She always did. But because May Sullivan didn't take what she hadn't earned herself, that was the rule those $34 had taught her, and she wasn't going to break that rule for anyone, not even for the man she had dragged out of the snow. In November, Bree brought home an assignment from school. The teacher had told the children to write a letter to a friend, and Bree wrote on lined notebook paper and pencil, letters uneven and slanting, with a stag beetle sticker in the corner, because Bree didn't have a bird sticker, but she did have bug stickers, and to Bree, bugs were better than birds. The letter was addressed to Mr. Reed. I'm reading the book you gave me. I don't understand all of it, but Mom helps me. There's a boy in the book named Cal, and I think he's sad. I started school. Josie sits next to me. Josie has a cat named Potato. I told Josie about Colonel, but I didn't tell her Colonel only has 3 legs because I didn't want Josie to pity Colonel. Colonel doesn't pity himself. I hope your ribs feel better. Signed, Bree Sullivan, with the B written larger than all the other letters. So large it took up nearly half the line. Because Bree wrote her own name with the kind of pride only children have, the kind of pride in simply existing. May looked at the letter and didn't correct the spelling, and didn't tell Bree to write another one to someone more appropriate. She took an envelope, put a stamp on it, and sent it through Finn because that was the only route she had. And she sent it because Bree wanted to send it, and May had never stopped Bree from believing in the people Bree chose to believe in, even when May herself didn't know whether she believed in them or not. The letter arrived at Reed Callahan's office in Seattle on a Thursday in November, passed from Finn to the desk on the highest floor of the building Reed owned, a glass office from floor to ceiling with the city spread out beneath it, and Reed sat behind the desk in a 3-piece suit, scar along his jaw, ribs healed but still aching when the weather turned cold. And he opened the envelope, took out the lined sheet of notebook paper with the stag beetle sticker in the corner, and read it, then read it again, then folded it back along the same old crease, carefully, as if the sheet of paper were evidence of something he needed to preserve exactly as it was. Finn stood in the doorway watching him. Bad news? Finn asked. No, Reed said, and he slipped the letter into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, on the left side, near his chest. Not in the desk drawer, not in a file, not anywhere he kept business papers or evidence or anything else belonging to the empire he ran, but in his jacket pocket, where he could feel it every time he breathed. And he turned back toward the window, looking out over the city, looking past the city, eastward, toward the mountains he couldn't see from here but knew were there, white, cold. And somewhere beyond those mountains, a small cabin, a child drawing bugs, and a woman who wasn't withdrawing money from the account he had left because she didn't take what she hadn't earned, and Reed Callahan sat in his glass tower in Seattle with a 6-year-old child's letter in his suit pocket and thought that it was probably the most valuable thing he owned. In December, 1 year after the storm, May Sullivan was working the night shift at the gas station when a black sedan pulled up to pump number 3. Not an SUV, not the kind of vehicle she had dragged a man out of a year earlier. A sedan, discreet, clean, the kind of car driven by someone who didn't want attention but that anyone who did notice would know was expensive. May looked out through the gas station window, one hand still resting on the book she was reading, Of Mice and Men, Steinbeck. The 3rd Steinbeck book she had read since a bent spine paperback had appeared on her kitchen table one winter morning last year. And she would never admit to anyone that she had started reading Steinbeck because of him, but she knew, and that was enough. The car door opened. Reed Callahan stepped out. The scar along his jaw was still there. The 3-piece suit was still there. But something was different. Not very different. Someone who didn't know him wouldn't have noticed. But May knew him in the way that 4 days in a cabin during a snowstorm teaches you to know a person. And she saw it. His shoulders sat lower, not from exhaustion, but lighter, as if he had carried something very heavy on them for a very long time and had finally set it down. Not all of it, but enough to stand straighter. He didn't come inside the station. He stood beside the car in the cold, hands in the pockets of his coat, his breath turning to vapor in front of him, and waited. Waited for her to look out. Waited for her to decide, because Reed Callahan had learned one thing in those 4 days in that cabin that the previous 36 years had never taught him. That there are some doors you don't push. You stand outside and wait for the person inside to open them. May set the book face down on the counter, the page unfinished, and walked outside. The cold struck her face, familiar, smelling of snow and gasoline and Montana night, and she stood facing him, 3 steps away, both of their breaths turning white between them, and neither of them said anything for a few seconds, because those few seconds needed to exist, needed to have space, like the pause between two notes without which a song isn't a song. Paxton got 35 years, Reed said. I know, May said. I read the news. Silence. A light wind pushed powder snow across the parking lot. Is the little girl doing all right? Reed said. She's teaching Josie how to classify beetles by family. Josie hates it, but she still listens. Almost a smile. Almost. You didn't take the money out, Reed said. I don't take what I didn't earn, May said. And her voice wasn't hard, wasn't angry, wasn't proud, only truth. Simple and clear, like every truth she had spoken to him since the first night. Reed looked at her, and she saw him searching for a way to say something he hadn't been able to say in a year. Something larger than money and more complicated than thank you. And he said, I owe you a life, then stopped, then added, and your daughter owes me a book review. And it was the closest Reed Callahan could come to humor without losing control. And May didn't laugh, but one corner of her mouth lifted, just slightly, just enough. Silence again. Longer, but not heavy. Lighter, like snowfall. I don't know how to do this, Reed said, his voice lower than before. Closer even though he hadn't stepped closer. Be somewhere I don't control everything. May looked at him, and she thought about the 4 days in the cabin, thought about her wrist and his hand, thought about Bree reading on the floor, thought about the cellar beneath the kitchen floor, and the 2 coffee cups, and the note under the refrigerator, and she said, I don't either. 4 words. And inside those 4 words was everything May Sullivan didn't say, that she didn't know how either, that she was afraid too, that she had built everything alone too, and didn't know how to let someone step in without feeling as if she were losing control. But she was standing here, outside the gas station, in the cold night, and she wasn't going back inside, and that was more than she had given anyone in the last 11 years. Colonel still has 3 legs, Reed said. Still 3 legs, May said. Still afraid of cats. Reed nodded slowly, as if that were the best news he had heard all year, and maybe it was. The next morning, gray sky, light snow, soft wind. Reed Callahan stood on the porch of May Sullivan's cabin holding 2 cups of coffee, his body tilted slightly to the right, because his left side still ached when the weather turned cold, and probably always would, because it was the kind of wound that left a permanent mark, and he had driven from the only motel in town before dawn, because Reed Callahan still woke before dawn, still watched doors, still couldn't sleep in strange places. Only this time, he was awake not from fear, but because he didn't want to miss the morning. The door opened. Bree stood there, hair tangled, eyes puffy with sleep, an oversized sweater hanging over her hands, and she looked at him, looked at the 2 cups of coffee, and said in a completely serious voice, Did you bring milk for me? Reed looked down at her and said, No, but I brought this. He pulled from his coat pocket a book, hardcover, brand new, dark green, with gold lettering, a field guide to beetles of North America, and Bree took it, and opened it, and her eyes lit up in the way only a child can, completely, without holding back, without calculation, without fear of disappointment. Your mouth.